Okay, well, thank you. This is an interesting session. Ishak's paper has politics in the title. Tanguy's paper doesn't have psychology in the title, but it's about psychology. And my paper is neither politics nor psychology. It actually fits better with the papers in the morning sessions, because it's about structural change and poverty. So I'm afraid it's going to be déjà vu for this audience, but that's the way the program has turned out to be. So that's the sort of outline. Now, the motivation for me is when I go to rural development conferences, here's what I hear. Right? There's urban bias in policy making. Rural development must remain the priority. Incidence of poverty is higher there. Total number of poor is also higher because there are more rural people. And of course, rural development will slow urbanization and its problems. Okay, that's the sort of message one gets. Then when you go to urban development conferences, which I go to as well, which in fact I've been organizing recently, it says too much attention to rural development. There's new focus needed on urban development. In some cases, depth of urban poverty is greater. There's an inexorable march of urbanization. The number of urban poor is growing. So we better get ready for tomorrow's poverty. That's why we need investment in urban things. Of course, in sensible IFPRI type conferences, we say you need a bit of both. The issue is really prioritization, sequencing, etc. So the question that I want to pose is, at the margin, how to prioritize the spending of scarce public resources if the objective is national poverty reduction. And what I want to do is to develop a framework in which we can address this question and show a very simple theoretical illustration, just a particular lens through which to see this problem. And it's related to the papers that you saw this morning by Dorosh and Thurlow and by Christensen. Okay? Those are the two papers that link most closely to this, but they're related broadly to the discussions this morning. And as I said, I hope the framework begins to identify in a general way theoretical and empirical research agendas, but the specific take-home message that I want to give from this presentation is that the answer to the question, rural development or urban development, depends on how exactly we measure poverty. In particular, it makes a difference whether your focus is on the incidence of poverty or on the depth of poverty. That's a particular message that I want us to leave with, so that you need to look at this, look at the exact nature of poverty more carefully. So let's recall the Macmillan-Roderick thing on productivity. You'll see national productivity is a weighted sum of sectoral productivities. Remember that? Where xi, the population weights, and pi is the sectoral productivity. So of course, a change in productivity is composed of two terms. There's the within term, the change within each sector weighted by the population size in that sector, and the structural change term, which is population shift across the different sectors. And that's what productivity is in the Macmillan-Roderick framework. Well, if P was not productivity but poverty, we would have exactly the same story. Because national poverty, just think of the national incidence of poverty, is a weighted sum of the sectoral incidences of poverty. Okay. And a change in national poverty is then composed of two terms. There's a within term, which is the change in each sector's poverty, weighted by the population of that sector. And the second term, which is the structural change term, which is poverty weighted by the change in population movement toward that sector. Okay. So this is what those first three bullets say. And note that this links very much to a distributional literature, which goes back a long way to Kuznets and so on. Kuznets talked about it in these terms: population shift from this distribution to that distribution, and so on. And many of us, including Sudhiranand and myself, have worked on this literature. So the question is, of course, how would you measure poverty in this setting? Well, there are different options. There's the incidence of poverty. There's the depth of poverty, which is a P1 measure. There's the severity of poverty, which is P2 measure. And for all three of these, you can write poverty as it's additively decomposable, so you can write it as the sectoral weighted sum of sectoral poverty. Therefore, the P story goes through whether it's P0, P1, or P2. So, given this, and given that Macmillan-Roderick formula, there are two directions of analysis. Okay? One is, for a specific country, we can decompose the actual poverty change into the within sector term and into the structural change component. And we can then relate these to observed policy changes. So I have a very specific proposal to Maggie and to Paul and so on, which is, given the information that you do have for your country-specific things, you can actually do this. And you can actually in some sense, reproduce the very same graphs that you have in the Macmillan-Roderick paper in terms of how the spread in the PIs has changed, et cetera, and begin to tell a story of how poverty change can be decomposed into these things, and then what are the policy contributions to those changes. Very straight. And the papers that I'm looking at, the Uganda paper and so on, almost do it, but not quite. But I suppose because they haven't posed a question in that way. The country studies that I looked at, certainly. Maybe some studies have done that. So that's one line you could go, and I'm not going to follow that line here. The second is to develop simple models of the joint determination of sectoral distributions and migration, and use these simple models to assess alternative policies such as quote-unquote rural development versus urban development. One could, of course, have complicated models of the joint determination, like the CG model that Dorosh and Thurlow put forward. But the lens that I want to look at it through, to look at this thing through, is simple models of migration. I'm going to take this route here. So the particular model that I want to look at, which has been mentioned many times before, is some sort of a Lewis-Harris-Todaro type model. Okay? And you'll see this is a very simple model, but it's actually very, very rich in terms of the possibilities and the way it allows us to think about different things. Okay? So there's a rural wage, WR. There's an urban formal wage, WM. There's an urban informal wage, WI. You're all very familiar with this. And the probability of getting a formal job, probability of getting the WM job, is pi. There's a migration equilibrium in these models, which is given by, in this case, the equality of expected income in the urban sector equated to the expected income in the rural sector. The rural sector income is certain, the urban sector income is uncertain. Okay? And you can play with this a lot, and you can add a risk premium and all that sort of stuff. You can complicate these things tremendously. And the specification of pi, the specification of the probability of getting an urban job, is the employment rate in the urban sector. Is the number of formal sector jobs compared to overall jobs. This is very straightforward and well known. So here's what the picture looks like. So you have the rural sector. There are LR people in that sector, and they have a choice between going to the urban sector. If they go, with certain probability they end up here, with certain probability they end up here. Okay. Here's the poverty line, and I'm going to place it between WM and WR. That's where you get the interesting results. Okay. Actually, we've now specified the entire income distribution in this society. Because, in fact, the migration equilibrium ties down all these quantities. Okay. Given LM exogenously, WM exogenously, WI exogenously, WI, it ties down LI, it ties down the entire income distribution. And actually, you can complicate this model now as much as you please. Okay. You could, for example, this WR being fixed is, if you like, a Lewis-like assumption. It's the supply price of labor is fixed to the urban sector, it will not change. You could, for example, make WI a function of LI. You could make WM a function of whatever. In fact, you can go the route that Dorosh and Thurlow go in specifying in greater detail the production side of the story. You could, in fact, have people going not just to one urban location, but to two urban locations, middle-sized cities and large cities. You'd have to then specify a migration equilibrium for that set. Okay. So systematically, you can specify the distribution of income linked to the migration equilibrium, linked to all these other things. And this is actually quite a powerful way, I think, of thinking about the implications of rural development versus urban development. So how do we think about this? We have a certain amount of money, public resources, and we're going to throw it at it. We're going to throw money at the problem, which is, of course, what you do in all our exercises. We basically throw money at the problem. The issue is, how is that money translated into the income distribution changes, and how is that money translated into movement of people from one sector to another? That depends upon your migration model, depends upon your model of the economy, etc., etc. Okay. So I'm going to be very complicated. I can have fertilizer subsidies, etc., but ultimately the question is, how is a sectoral distribution affected by throwing money at this sector versus at this sector? So there's a very simple way to think about this. As I said, the overall change in poverty can be thought of as change of poverty in this sector, change of poverty in this sector, and change of the population weights between the two sectors. That's what the Macmillan-Roderick formula tells you. So suppose my objective was minimizing the headcount ratio, the incidence of poverty, the number of people below the poverty line. Okay. And I have $1 to throw at this. Should I throw it here, or should I throw it here? Well, you know, this is a marginal change. The $1, it's a small amount that you're throwing. It actually doesn't matter where you throw it. It's not going to help this person cross the poverty line. It's not going to help this person cross the poverty line. In other words, the two, you're indifferent between the two in terms of the within sector effects. But if I throw $1 at this sector, it's going to induce people to migrate. That comes from the migration equilibrium. And of course, some of them are going to end up above the poverty line, some are going to end up even worse off, but that doesn't matter because you're only concerned about the headcount ratio, only concerned about the number of people below the poverty line. So, what I've just shown is that the incidence of poverty is your objective, okay? Throwing money at the rural sector will not change poverty. In fact, it will increase it because it's going to suck people back into the rural sector. Throwing money at the urban sector is the way that you're going to reduce poverty in this simple setting. So, you can have as complicated a CGE model as you like. You can have as complicated a specification. At the end of the day, it's going to be what is the impact on these distributions, and I've given you a story of how that will feed through the poverty indices. You can make it much more complicated. The key point is that the density of the poverty line matters in these settings. Suppose now your objective is the P1 measure of poverty, the depth of poverty. Okay. Now it's very interesting, okay? Because of course the headcount ratio is less in the urban sector in this setting, but some of the poor are poorer than these people here. That's what we've been talking about a lot, referring to the depth of urban poverty, etc. In fact, you can show, I'm not going to demonstrate this, but if this equilibrium condition is met, P1 measure will always be higher in the urban sector than in the rural sector. Because these people are poorer, there are fewer of them, true, but the numbers effect is not dominated by the fact that these people are poorer, and the P1 measure will be higher in this equilibrium. Now I have $1, and I'm going to throw it at this distribution. Where should I throw it? Okay. And remember, if I throw it here, it will induce movement from here to here. It will induce movement into the sector which has the higher P1. So for that part of the term, poverty will go up in this simple setting. What about the within sector effect? Okay. Where will the effect on P1 be greatest if I throw it here versus there? Well, it depends on what happens to that $1 when you throw it. Okay. Suppose when I throw the $1 in this sector, it is divided equally amongst all people in this sector. In other words, in some sense, perfectly untargeted expenditures. You could do it with proportional effect. You can do it all sorts of ways. I'm just thinking through particular methods of this. So I throw it, it's divided equally. Okay. I throw it, it's divided equally, i.e. this person gets it. Okay. Remember, the objective is the poverty gap. It's the depth of poverty is the objective function. Okay. The entire $1 goes to this person. In this case, only part of the $1 goes to this person. Therefore, it is better to throw it here. So I just showed that your objective is P1. You should do rural development as your focus. So it matters whether your objective is P0 or P1. And we can complicate this as much as you like. Okay, as I said, you can put in production functions here, you can put in other things, etc., etc. Ultimately, these are the economic forces that are going to be leading you to come up with one answer rather than the other. And I suppose this could be one way of understanding the output of a more complicated CGE type model. So, if the objective, in this very simple framework, if the objective is national incidence of poverty, then urban development reduces poverty more than rural development. If the objective if the national objective is the depth of poverty P1, and urban P1 is higher or not too much lower than rural P1, then rural development reduces poverty more than urban development. So what P you have makes a difference. That's the only thing I wanted to establish in this thing. Maybe it's an obvious point, but the distinction between the different measures of poverty has not come across as strongly in these papers as one might expect. So, third bullet, the answer to the question, rural development or urban development, depends on whether the national objective is to reduce P0 or P1. And you know, one can complicate this thing considerably, and we've done it in our papers and so on. Here are some things for further research. Theory. You can, for this very specific case, for this very specific model, which is actually quite a rich model, despite its simplicity. It's quite a powerful little model. What are the specific results for the severity of poverty index, the P2 index? And you can derive those. Extension is under theory, which is to apply this framework for other migration models, not just the Harris-Todaro type of models. I mean, a standard issue about migration models and migration theory, and many of us have worked on this, is that migration is a selective process. Okay? So migration rates, out-migration rates, depend upon your origin income. In fact, from starting from low income levels, the sort of stylized finding is that they increase as your income increases. Then they peak, and then maybe they fall. So to get a richer model of migration into this setting. So that's selectivity in rural areas. And then the theory, third one, is to incorporate dynamics with agglomeration externalities. So I just assume that when I throw this money, it goes into the urban sector and that's it. That's the end of the story. Of course, I can begin to complicate it more. The way that Dorosh and Thurlow do it is they have an agglomeration function, and that's it. They say that the effect of productivity growth of agglomeration is this function f, and then an elasticity is put into that. But I could do the same thing. I could have that elasticity appropriately incorporated. And of course, it will depend on what the elasticity is. But one can show how, as that elasticity varies, whether these results are overturned or not. On the empirical front, as I've already said, I think we can do the income poverty and income distribution analogs to the Macmillan-Roderick productivity decompositions. And I think we can begin to tell those stories using the information that's actually already there in the country papers. It's just that they've not been quite turned to that effect. And the final point I want to make comes back to points that have been made in the discussions. Namely, this is horribly all endogenously, everything's related to everything else. That's just made so clear by the Harris-Todaro equilibrium. It is a migration equilibrium. Okay? So everything is indeed endogenously related to everything else. So to find what is the exogenous shift in this is a difficult thing to do. So my sort of suggestion is that we should perhaps, and this relates a little bit to Ishak's presentation, is perhaps using deep institutional country-specific knowledge, identify natural experiments. Okay? Switches in policy regimes, which, from our institutional knowledge, we can say were perhaps orthogonal to other things going on in the model. Okay? And so there's a switch in party which comes in, and the switch is because of some other reason, some scandal has happened or whatever. But part of this party's platform is strong rural development or strong whatever. I mean, you would have to argue that case on corroborative basis. You have to give a lot of corroborative evidence to that. Okay? But if you can establish that this comes close to a natural experiment, that then gives you an exogeneity of which you can begin to identify the effects that we've been talking about in the first two sessions. We did this a little bit, Javo and I, in our paper on China, where we identified policy regimes over the last 50 years in China. Now, obviously, you have to believe our classification of those regimes. But to the extent that you do, we identified points at which the stance shifted from centralization to decentralization, from focus on agriculture to focus on outward-oriented development and so on. And then on that basis, we identified the impact on, in our case, particular case, spatial inequality. In fact, in the subsequent work that Shengen, Jabo, and I have done for the Chinese 12th plan, we identify actually a very recent move, starting in about 2000, a shift in Chinese stance. Very worried about spatial inequality. So that identification comes from outside. It doesn't come from within the system. But if you believe that, then you can see that from 2000 onwards, spatial inequalities have in fact begun to turn down in China. So I give you that as an example of how using our institutional knowledge to identify natural experiments through shifts in policy regimes, we might be able to get the exogenous variation that can help us identify these effects. Thank you.